All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Mindgasms. Chief Keefe is back again today, of course, for another episode of Delusional. This is Delusional 12. We're going to talk about Deleuze's thoughts on, I'm going to try to say his name in the French way here, Henri Bergson, who it looks like was a 20th century French philosopher who seemed to be sort of an empiricist and a champion of intuition, at least according to Wikipedia. So, yeah, do you want to start off with an introduction there, as you always do there, Tim?
I sure can. Okay. Sorry, just want to get my notes here. All right. So for this even number episode, we're going to be covering Henri Bergson, who is an interesting figure in the history of philosophy, often ignored, although in his day he was quite an important philosopher. And he was particularly important for Deleuze, and he falls into the category of a friend, an ally,
Right.
not an enemy.
Yeah, because Deleuze, in this book, he basically makes people like the philosophers he discusses are either allies or enemies.
Yes, more or less.
Cool.
Okay, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and go to the Stanford the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to give us some background on Bergson before we actually jump into that essay in the philosophical lineage. Okay, so Bergson was born in 1859, and he came from a Jewish family. He spent most of his life in Paris. Although it says that he became a French citizen in 1878, so he was born in France, but looks like maybe he wasn't a citizen at the time. But anyways, so then what is key to Bergson are time, particularly duration, um, the concept of multiplicity, which is very important for Deleuze, and what else we got here? Perception and memory, creative evolution, and the method of intuition. Okay.
Okay.
So basically, what Bergson was, he was a reactionary against, at the time, and this was in the late 19th century, going into the early 20th century, against a mechanistic philosophy. What does
Okay.
that mean? Okay. So, mechanistic meaning materialist, the world operates according to very strict laws. There is no room for anything that one would consider immaterial or spiritual or anything like that. Strict mechanistic view.
It sounds similar to scientific materialism.
Yes. Also, he was against Herbert Spencer, who was an important English philosopher at the time, a devotee of evolutionary philosophy, because this was not very much far off from Darwin's time.
Okay.
Okay. However, I'm a little bit fuzzy on Spencer, so let me look up him here. I have read him before, but it's been a while. This was way back in the day.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So according to Wikipedia, quote, Spencer developed an all-embracing conception of evolution as the progressive development of the physical world, biological organisms, the human mind, and human culture and societies. As a polymath, he contributed to a wide range of subjects, including ethics, religion, anthropology, economics, political theory, philosophy, literature, astronomy, biology, sociology, and psychology. He was quite busy.
Wow. He really was a polymath.
Yes, he was. All right. Spencer is best known for the expression survival of the fittest, which he coined in Principles of Biology after reading Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species.
Oh,
This,
cool.
this term strongly suggests natural selection, yet as Spencer extended evolution into realms of sociology and ethics, he also made use of Lamarckism. So Lamarck is after Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who it's the hypothesis that an organism can pass on characteristics that it has acquired through use or disuse during its lifetime to its offspring. It is also known as the inheritance of acquired characteristics or soft inheritance. inaccurately named after the French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who incorporated the action of soft inheritance into his evolutionary theories as a supplement to his concept of orthogenesis, which is a drive towards complexity. The theory is cited in textbooks in contrast to Darwinism, and this paints a false picture of the history of biology, as Lamarck did not originate the idea of soft inheritance, which was known from the classical era onwards. So Lamarck is often is set up as an opponent to Darwin. Okay, but the important
I'm still a little unclear. I'm such a stoner blowing smoke out of my mouth while talking. I'm still a little unclear about why they were opposed.
okay, because Darwin was the first about evolution. Okay, now the interesting thing about Spencer is that he was the one who coined the term survival of the fittest,
Yeah, that's
not
very
Darwin.
interesting.
Also the important thing about Spencer is that he took evolutionary theory and he extended it to a lot of other fields that are only loosely connected with biology. So, particularly in the Gilded Age in the United States, you had the survival of the fittest, where the rich industrialists believed themselves to be at the top of the heap. They were
Right,
the fittest ones, and this is where social Darwinism came into the picture,
right.
which again was influenced by Spencer. So this was a misappropriation of a biological theory that didn't have anything to do with other fields.
That
Although,
sounds similar to eugenics too.
yes, sounds similar to eugenics. Although eugenics again involving oneself interfering with evolution, a natural evolution to steer it in one direction.
Yeah,
So with Lamarck, just briefly in passing, is that instead of evolution, inheritance of acquired characteristics. So a particular biological organism has characteristics that it acquires through use or disuse. Okay, so like increased strength is one. The organism acquires increased strength, passes it on to its organism, to its offspring. Or if it is born with something that it doesn't use, that does not get passed on to its offspring. Okay, follow me so far?
yeah.
Okay. However, with evolution, it is whatever evolution deems is the fittest to enable the um, organism to survive. So there's no inheritance of acquired characteristics necessarily. Now, there might
And
be, if this
but
is
in
the kind,
terms, oh, sorry.
yeah. So there might be some kind of inheritance of acquired characteristics with Darwin, because whatever the organism, or whatever enables the organism to survive, it will pass on to its offspring. But it might already be there. And the thing about evolution and the survival of the fittest is that there might be a collection of organisms that maybe have superior strength, but not every one of them is going to survive. There might be something else in that organism that allows it to survive and then pass on those characteristics, those genes to its offspring.
That's actually pretty much exactly the sort of thing I was just thinking about because Darwin, what what he meant by survival of the fittest was more survival of the most adaptable, which
Right,
is sort of what you just explained. Like an individual could be stronger, but that wouldn't necessarily be the most adaptable for its environment.
right. Or the organism could survive with increased strength, but then circumstances in the environment changes and such where it becomes a detriment instead of a
Right,
benefit.
right,
So then that organism consequently doesn't survive.
right.
Okay. So yeah, survival of the fittest doesn't mean strong prey upon the weak. This was the unfortunate development from Spencer. It's rather whatever enables the organism to survive and whatever the environment it finds itself in.
Right.
Okay. So let's go back to Bergson. So Bergson was reacting against Darwinism in a way. Now, he didn't completely do away with evolution, but he was against a mechanistic understanding of evolution, which we'll
Okay.
get to in a second. Okay. So continuing on, The first is the concept of multiplicity. Okay, so
You still there?
a multiplicity indicate perhaps the most basic difference between
Your
Bergsonism.
audio got cut out for about 20 seconds there.
Oh, okay, let me try it again. Here, two prepositions to and of indicate perhaps the most basic difference between Bergsonism and phenomenology. Of course, this phrase is the title of Bergson's first work, the essay on the immediate given of consciousness, which is translated into Time and Free Will. So time and free will is an attack on Kant, for whom
What does he mean by the given of consciousness?
Whatever is given to consciousness. I think we covered this once before in a previous, I think we did this with Hayden. Okay. So the myth of the given, when we're talking about Sellers, is that something is already there that is given to consciousness or given to perception.
Right.
Okay.
So it's like an inherent property rather than an emergent one, something like that.
No, I wouldn't say it was an emergent. No, I wouldn't say that's an emergent property.
Okay.
So something is already there. Something is already like reality is given to us, and it is up to us to determine how we're going to parse out reality versus questioning, is reality something that's really given, or is it something that's also made by consciousness or by perception?
Okay.
There's a two-way street going on here.
Okay.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So, time and free will has to be seen as an attack on Kant, for whom freedom belongs as a realm outside of time and space. Okay? Bergson thinks that Kant has confused space and time in a mixture, with the result that we must conceive human action as determined by natural causality. Bergson offers a twofold response. On the one hand, in order to define consciousness and therefore freedom, Bergson has to differentiate between time and space, to unmix them, we might say. On the other hand, through the differentiation, he defines the immediate data of consciousness as being temporal, in other words, as the duration, which is a translation of the French la durée. In the duration, there is no juxtaposition of events. Therefore, there is no mechanistic causality. It is in the duration that we speak of the experience of freedom. Okay, so in other words, instead of seeing time as a succession of points, A, B, C, D, and so on, this is where causality enters into the picture. And a mechanistic approach is to get to what are the laws that govern A causing B, causing C, causing D, and so on. This is the mechanistic causality. However, if you look at time as a multiplicity, now what's important about multiplicity, because we've seen this already here and there in the other essays with Deleuze, is that time is taken as something singular, but also a multiple. Make sense?
No.
Okay.
How so?
Okay. So let's go back to the ABC. That's a common sense understanding of time.
Right.
Here's an event, here's an event, here's an event, here's an event. The past, now. It's a succession of events. Okay? That's a commonsensical approach to it.
Right.
You can parse it down. But one could argue, as does Bergson in a certain respect, that our perception of time is not as a succession of events. If we look at it as a succession of events, we're already starting to abstract and really dig down to say, okay, so we can point to this A and say that A caused B, B caused C, and so on. But the day-to-day generalistic experience of time is more of, as Bergson is getting to, is a duration. We have a starting point and we have a stopping point, and there's many things that have happened in the space of that duration. Okay.
Right.
So, like in the context of our episodes that we do here, here's the time that we start. Here's the time that we end. We're not concerned about, okay, so I'm saying this, and then Andrew's going to say that, and I'm going to say this again, or whatever it is. I'm really getting down to the parsing what's happening with A, B, C, D. Even getting down to the to the minute second about what is happening
Right.
in the course of this podcast. We don't experience time that way. We tend to experience it as a duration, so Bergson says. Here's a starting point, here's an ending point, and everything that happens in between.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
And that's like that. That's not necessary. Well, I think we probably talked before too about how that's not necessarily like this idea of time as a progression of events. Like this happened back in time, and now we're in the present, and then there's
right.
going to be the future. Is not necessarily the way the world actually realistically works.
No. And then the last essay we covered Freud. And so Deleuze was using Freud as the syntheses of time. That's what he was discussing. So past, present,
Oh, you
future.
still there?
I'm still here.
Oh,
Can you hear me?
I think your audio got cut out for about 10 seconds again there.
Okay. So he talks about the synthesis of time, which is there's past, present, future, but the past is already part of the present. The future has not happened, but in a sense, the future is already becoming part of the present.
Oh, that's a much more interesting way of looking at it.
Right. So you're not sectioning off past, present, future as past has happened, the present is happening, the future is happening. Instead, there's this bleeding over into each one of these.
Right.
That's getting close to what Bergson was talking about with the duration. So then as it continues in the encyclopedia article, is that it is in the duration that we can speak of the experience of freedom. Okay, that's an important point. If we're only looking at time as a juxtaposition of A, B, C, D, explaining it mechanistically in a causal manner, then how can we speak of freedom? See, Bergson again is against the mechanistic philosophy because it doesn't allow for freedom.
Because due to causation, in that sense?
Well, again, a mechanistic causality.
Right.
Okay, so we're leaving aside the existence of something causality. Sure. No, we'd seen this with Hume.
Right.
Hume doesn't believe in causality as something that is objectively existing in reality. It's just a habit that we have formed in the mind because we see this juxtaposition of the A, B, C, D, and we say that A causes B, B causes C, and so on.
And it seems like Bergson is sort of saying that if you adhere to causality in that way, it's sort of almost like you're a slave to causality in a way.
Right. Again, the mechanism or deterministic approach to it. If you take a mechanistic or a determinist approach, you don't allow freedom.
Yeah. That makes sense.
So by instead looking at the duration, where there's no juxtaposition of events, then you can speak of freedom.
Right.
Okay. So then continuing, for Bergson, we must understand the duration as a qualitative multiplicity, as opposed to a quantitative multiplicity. As the name suggests, a quantitative multiplicity enumerates things or states of consciousness by means of externalizing one from another in a homogeneous space. In contrast, a qualitative multiplicity consists in a temporal heterogeneity, in which several conscious states are organized into a whole, permeate one another, and gradually gain a richer content. Bergson even insists that the word several is inappropriate to qualitative multiplicity because it suggests numbering. Okay.
So what does he mean by temporal heterogeneity?
Okay, good question. So temporal referring to time, heterogeneity referring to things that are not similar.
Okay.
Versus homogeneity, things that are similar. So here's one way to look at it in terms of a composite. Okay, so if you look at an abstract painting, take a Jackson Pollock. When Pollock created his paintings, he spilled paint over on this side, he drew this line, he spilled paint over here. He just continued to repeat it until he stopped. When you draw away from it, things blend into one another, and so the work of art appears.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so let me finish here. Let's follow with this analogy. So you're not focusing on this line or this splotch, this line over here blazed into this splotch or whatever it is. You could, but that's really getting down to the abstraction. And then you start to think of the painting, the Jackson Pollock painting, as heterogeneity, because this line is not the same as this line, this splotch is not the same as this splotch, and so on. That's where the heterogeneity comes in.
Right.
Rather, if you think of the painting as a whole, then it becomes somewhat homogeneous in space. Okay?
Right.
So, what he's getting at in terms of temporal, particularly as, again, we're talking about the duration here. The multiplicity is like that Jackson Pollock painting, qualitatively speaking, not quantitatively speaking, because then we're starting to count how many lines are in the painting, how many splotches are in the painting. Okay?
Right.
Follow me so far?
Yep.
Okay. So with temporal heterogeneity, this is A, B, C, D. This thought follows this thought, causes this thought, follows this thought, references this thought, and so on. Everything that is distinct. And the thoughts are heterogeneous is because you won't necessarily have the same thought.
Right.
Okay. That's the qualitative multiplicity. But if you take the approach of the duration, then it is a qualitative multiplicity. And there is a temporal element to it. And there are things that exist within that duration, this thought, this feeling, this conscious perception, or whatever it is. But you are not focusing on each one of them individually and counting them. Okay?
Right.
Makes
You're
sense?
seeing
Now
them as
referring back to the Jackson Pollock painting, the painting emerges from the collection of everything there. It's a composite.
Right.
Okay?
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So again, Bergson even insists that the word several is inappropriate to qualitative multiplicity because it suggests numbering.
Okay.
Okay, continuing. When we look at a flock of sheep, what we notice is that they all look alike. We sense no qualitative change as we move from one to another. We also notice that we can enumerate the sheep. Here a sheep, there a sheep. We are able to enumerate them because each sheep is spatially separated from or juxtaposed to the others. In other words, each occupies a discernible spatial location. Therefore, quantitative multiplicities, as Bergson says, are homogeneous and spatial. Moreover, because a quantitative multiplicity is homogeneous, we can represent it with a symbol. For example, a sum, 25. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now that's an important point. So with the sheep, if you're looking at a quantitative multiplicity, each one of them almost look the same, more or less, and they occupy space. But when you say, how many sheep are there? And you say 25, that's a quantitative multiplicity. You represent it with a symbol. A symbol. Okay? That's the quantitative multiplicity.
Right.
Continuing, the idea of qualitative multiplicities is difficult to understand, although it is at the heart of Bergson's thinking. Normally, we would think that if there is heterogeneity, there has to be juxtaposition. But in qualitative multiplicities, there is heterogeneity and no juxtaposition. Qualitative multiplicities are temporal. Qualitative multiplicity defines the duration. As with quantitative multiplicities, Bergson gives us many examples. But perhaps the easiest example to grasp is the feeling of sympathy, a moral feeling. Another example would be a piece of music. Okay? So a piece of music is a multiplicity, collection of notes from different instruments.
Okay.
But when you're hearing a piece of music, regardless of what it is, that could be classical music, could be hard rock, could be jazz, could be ragtime, whatever it is, you're experiencing it as a whole and as a duration because music exists within time.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah, that's interesting. That makes a
With
lot of
any piece
sense.
of music, there's a beginning, there's an end. The piece
Mm-hmm.
begins, the piece ends. Then if it repeats, you might not hear the same things the second time it comes around.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Like you notice that if with like a really good movie or a book that you've read or seen several times, I know a lot of people find, including me, that you notice things almost each time you watch it that you didn't notice the first time you watch it, and you notice more different aspects of it every time.
Right. Or it could move you in a way that it didn't move you before.
Yeah, certainly.
Okay. That's a subject for aesthetics, but I'm using this as an illustration of what Bergson is trying to get at with a qualitative multiplicity and the duration.
Right.
Okay? So continuing with sympathy. Sympathy is not only the easiest to grasp, it is also significant. Our experience of sympathy begins, according to Bergson, with our putting ourselves in the place of others, feeling their pain. But if this were all, the feeling would inspire in us abhorrence of others, and we would want to avoid them, not help them. Bergson concedes that the feeling of horror may be at the root of sympathy, but then we realize that if we did not help this poor wretch, it is going to turn out that, when we need help, no one will come to our aid. There is a need to help the suffering. For Bergson, these two phases are inferior forms of pity. True pity, therefore, involves not so much fearing pain as of desiring it. It is as if nature has committed a great injustice, and what we want is to be seen as not complicit with it. Okay. So then we continue on with that, but I'll go ahead and skip there. In his introduction to metaphysics, Bergson gives us three images to help us think about the duration and therefore qualitative multiplicities. The first is that of two spools with a tape running between them, one spool unwinding the tape, the other winding it up. Duration resembles this image, according to Bergson, because as we grow older, our future grows smaller and our past larger. Okay. The benefit of this image is that it presents a continuity of experiences without juxtaposition. Yet there is a drawback. Because a tape moves between the two spools, the image presents the duration as being homogeneous, as if one could fold the tape back over its other parts, as if the tape were superposable, implying that two moments in consciousness might be identical, but no two moments are identical in a conscious being. Duration for Bergson is continuity of progress and heterogeneity. Moreover, thanks to this image, we can also see that duration implies a conservation of the past. All right? The second image of qualitative multiplicity is the color spectrum. We saw in the first image of the spools that there is a constant difference or heterogeneity. The color spectrum helps us understand this, since a color spectrum has a multiplicity of different shades or nuances of color. Here we have heterogeneity, but there's a drawback to this image as well. We lose the characteristic of continuity or unity since the spectrum has colors juxtaposed. And as Bergson says, pure duration excludes all idea of juxtaposition, reciprocal exteriority, and extension. Okay? So no juxtaposition, no exteriority, meaning you find it on the outside, and extension. Okay?
Right.
So then the third image is an elastic band being stretched. Bergson tells us first to contract the band into a mathematical point, which represents the now of our experience. Then draw it out to make a line growing progressively longer. He warns us not to focus on the line, but on the action which traces it. If we can focus on the action of tracing, then we can see that the movement, which is duration, is not only continuous and differentiating or heterogeneous, but also indivisible. We can always insert breaks into the spatial line that represents the motion, but the motion itself is indivisible. Okay? So if you're taking an arrow that you shoot into the air, the movement is one. The arrow leaves the bow, hits the target at some point, however long it takes to get there.
Mm-hmm.
So the motion itself is one. It is one thing. Now you can take a camera, take a picture of the arrow in flight, and that captures it at one point in the duration.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And you can take a camera and take many different photographs, each showing every little point in the path the arrow takes before it hits the target. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But duration is not only continuous and differentiating or heterogeneous, but it's also indivisible. Okay, so the duration, again, is not a quantitative multiplicity. A, B, C, D, all these distinct points. It is taken as one.
Right.
Okay, even though the arrow occupies a potentially infinite number of spaces going from the bow to the target.
Yeah.
That's where the multiplicity comes in.
So it's one, like, we look at the act of firing that arrow as one sort of event, but there are a multiplicity of factors that go into that event.
Sure, you take it as one.
Right.
So I draw back the bow. As soon as I shoot the arrow, and then from there until the arrow hits the target, is one thing. It's one event.
Yeah.
Taken as a whole, that one thing is the duration. And that's really what we speak of when we talk about a duration. Now, again, the piece of music starts, stops. Everything that happens between is the duration of the piece of music. It might last for 3 minutes, it might last for an hour, it might last for 10 seconds, however long the duration is.
Right.
And I really like the example of the music because it's a collection of notes. If you focus so much on the note, you miss the piece.
Right.
Okay?
But if you focus too much on the piece, then you might miss some really important notes too.
Sure. So continuing, for Bergson, there is always a priority of movement over the things that move. The thing that moves is an abstraction from the movement. So let's go back to the arrow example. If you focus on the arrow, you miss the movement. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that is duration and qualitative versus quantitative multiplicity. Okay.
Right.
So let's move to intuition.
Okay.
Okay. Bergson's thought must be seen as an attempt to overcome Kant. In Bergson's eyes, Kant's philosophy is scandalous, since it eliminates the possibility of absolute knowledge and admires metaphysics and antinomies, which are contradictions. Bergson's own method of intuition is supposed to restore the possibility of absolute knowledge. Here one should see a kinship between Bergson intuition and what Kant calls intellectual intuition and metaphysics. To do this, intuition in Bergson's sense must place us above the divisions of the different schools of philosophy, like rationalism and empiricism, or idealism and realism. Philosophy for Bergson does not consist in choosing between concepts and in taking sides. These antinomies of concepts and positions, according to him, result from the normal or habitual way our intelligence works. Here we find Bergson's connection to American pragmatism. The normal way our intelligence works is guided by needs, and thus the knowledge it gathers is not disinterested. It is relative knowledge. And how it gathers knowledge is through what Bergson calls analysis, that is, the dividing of things according to perspectives taken. Comprehensive analytic knowledge then consists in reconstruction or recomposition of a thing by means of synthesizing the perspectives. This synthesis, while helping us satisfy needs, never gives us the thing itself. It only gives us a general concept of things. Thus, intuition reverses the normal working of intelligence, which is interested in analytic, synthesis being only a development of analysis. In the fourth chapter to Matter and Memory, Bergson calls this reversal of habitual intelligence the turn to experience, where experience becomes concerned with utility, where it becomes human experience. This placement of oneself up above the turn is not easy. Above all else, Bergson appreciates effort. Intuition, therefore, is a kind of experience, and indeed Bergson himself calls his thought the true empiricism.
Hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
So let's
So his is the
unpack this a bit.
true empiricism because it's more based on in.
You dropped out there.
Oh, his is the more pure empiricism because it's based on intuition.
Well, he calls it the method of intuition. Okay, so
Okay.
let's to illustrate this, let's go back to the example of the piece of music. Okay. So analysis is focusing on the notes, focusing on the composer of the piece of music, what influenced the composer or songwriter, pick whatever genre you want to work with, the time period in which the composer wrote it, and other influences on that piece of music. Okay. So you notice that I've said a lot about the piece of music. I've conducted an analysis of it.
Mm-hmm.
So then when I stop, I reconstruct all these perspectives into something, an analysis of the piece of music. So, kind of in line with pragmatism, which is very much focused on needs and the cash value of something. That's what James had defined as truth. This helps us understand the piece of music from certain perspectives. But we haven't done anything about perceiving the piece of music. Okay? Follow me so far?
Mm-hmm.
So when you're listening to the piece of music and it evinces a reaction in you, maybe one of supreme joy or supreme disgust or of indifference, you know, perceiving it and maybe even having a feeling connected with it, that's the method of intuition.
Yeah.
And the turn to experience is experience, again, with a qualitative multiplicity, a la what we saw with the multiplicity. Yeah, the qualitative multiplicity with the duration. That kind of experience without trying to analyze experience in terms of colors or qualia was something that emerged, which is you actually are not perceiving the object, you are perceiving something related to the object in perception of the mind or consciousness or whatever it is.
Right.
That's one way of defining what empiricism is, but not in the way that Bergson defines it.
Right.
Okay. So if you're experiencing the piece of music, this is a, for lack of a better term, a quote, true type of experience, a human
Right.
experience that doesn't involve any kind of analysis.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
You're just talking about real life experiences.
Real life experiences, right. Okay.
Yeah.
So continuing, in order to help us understand intuition, which is always an intuition of duration, let us return to the color spectrum image. Bergson says that we should suppose that perhaps there is no other color than orange. Yet if we could enter into orange, that is, if we could sympathize with it, we would sense ourselves caught, as Bergson says, between red and yellow. This means that if we make an effort when we perceive orange, we sense a variety of shades. If we make more of an effort, we sense that the darkest shade of orange is a different color, red, while the lightest is also a different color, yellow. Thus, we would have a sense, beneath orange, of the whole color spectrum, because we're defining orange against something else, two other colors. So likewise, I may introspect and sympathize with my own duration. My duration may be the only one. But if I make an effort, I sense in my duration a variety of shades. In other words, the intuition of duration puts me in contact with the whole continuity of durations, which I could, with effort, try to follow upwardly or downwardly, upward to spirit or downward to inert matter. Thus, Bergsonian intuition is always an intuition of what is other. Here we see that Bergson has not only tried to break with Kant, but also Parmenides' philosophy of the same. Parmenides being the one that is defined against Heraclitus. Heraclitus said everything is in flux. Parmenides says all is one.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
Makes sense so far?
Yeah. So is Bergson saying that everything is in flux rather than everything is one then?
No. No, the purpose of that
Okay.
is to define what Parmenides is.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So again, he has not only tried to break with Kant, but also with Parmenides' philosophy of the same. So
Okay.
Parmenides saying that all is one was saying that there's no distinction.
Right.
Things don't change. We perceive them and we believe that they change, but they actually don't change because everything is one.
Right.
Okay, but Bergson is not going down that route.
Okay.
He's breaking with that. Okay. So another way to define about the duration is, again, let's look at the piece of music. I'm vaguely aware that I'm listening to a piece of music. This is apperception, philosophical term, perceiving of the perceiving.
Mm-hmm.
I'm perceiving this piece of music. I'm enjoying it. I'm having a certain emotional reaction to it, thinking about certain things. It engenders thoughts or whatever it is. All this is taking place within the duration. But then when I start to focus on it, this note changes here, this time signature changes here. Now we're starting to get into a definition from something else. So if there's a part of the piece and then it changes key, if we focus a lot on that, then we are defining that key change to something else. Okay? Instead of the key change is of a part of the piece of music within the duration. Okay? And then I like how it's defined about when you're moving upwardly towards spirit versus downward toward inert matter. Okay? The further and further you go in analysis, the more you're getting closer to inert matter, because then you're parsing out, you're picking things apart, which in many cases might result in looking at something physical or looking at something and possibly falling into a mechanistic explanation of it in the piece of music. You're not really paying much attention, or you're perceiving the piece of music. You're paying more attention to what instruments are involved. What instruments are involved? Instruments are physical things. Vibration coming from the strings. How does the violinist hold the violin? All these things. All these are thoughts that insert into your that emerge in your mind as you're paying very close attention to a piece of music instead of enjoying the music or perceiving the music as a piece of music.
Right.
Make sense?
Yeah. So like if you're focusing too much on a mechanistic analysis of a piece of music, you're sort of missing the forest through the trees in terms of the experience of the actual music.
Exactly. You're missing the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
Now, with the mechanistic approach, you really could take a different turn and start to explain the physics of the music.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's another way to do it too. That has its place.
Mm-hmm.
But again, when you're explaining the physics of the music, you're not using the method of intuition to perceive as a quote true form of experience the piece of music itself.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
All right. So that is the method of intuition. So let's go ahead and switch to perception and memory. All right. In the preface that he wrote in 1910, Bergson says that matter and memory is frankly dualistic, since it affirms both the reality of matter and the reality of spirit. However, he is quick to warn us that the aim of the book is to really overcome the theoretical difficulties which has always beset dualism, mind and matter. In the history of philosophy, these theoretical difficulties have generally arisen from a view of external perception, which always seems to result in an opposition between representation and matter. Thus, Bergson's theory of pure perception, laid out in the first chapter of Matter and Memory, aims to show that beyond both realism and idealism, our knowledge of things, in its pure state, takes place within the things it represents. In perception, Bergson demonstrates this point through his theory of pure perception. The image of a material thing becomes a representation. This is in the mind. A representation is always in the image virtually. Aha! We've seen this word before in Deleuze many times.
Yeah.
We should return to this concept of virtuality below. In any case, in perception, there is a transition from the image as being in itself to its being for me. But perception adds nothing new to the image. In fact, it subtracts from it. Representation is a diminution of the image. The transition from image to pure perception is discernment in the etymological sense of the word, a slicing up or a selection. According to Bergson, selection occurs because of necessities or utility based in our bodies. In other words, conscious representation results from the suppression of what has no interest for bodily functions and the conservation of only what it does interest bodily functions. The conscious perception of a living being, therefore, exhibits a necessary poverty.
Okay.
Okay, so what's important here is that Bergson is acknowledging the importance of the body in
Yeah.
representation and in perception. And you can see why he influenced Merleau-Ponty, very well-known French phenomenologist who was one of the few phenomenologists who actually paid a lot of attention to the body.
Yeah. That was like in Western philosophy in general, that seems kind of uncommon because with dualism, an aspect of that is often seeing the body as inferior to the mind.
Right, right. Okay, so let's let's read this again. According to Bergson, selection occurs because of necessities or utility based in our bodies. In other words, conscious representation results from the suppression of what has no interest for bodily functions and the conservation only of what does interest bodily functions. The conscious perception of a living being therefore exhibits a necessary poverty. If we can circle back for a moment, although Bergson shows that we perceive things in the things, the necessary poverty of perception means that it cannot define intuition. Turning back from the habitual use of intelligence for needs, very much like the pragmatists define it, intuition, as we can see now, places us above or below representations. Intuition is fundamentally unrepresentative. In this regard, the following passage, I'm not going to read it here, is about matter and memory. Like the descriptions of intuition, the passage describes how we can resolve the images of matter into mobile variations. In this way, we overcome the inadequacy of all images of duration. We would have to call the experience described here not a perception of matter, but a memory of matter because of its richness. As we have already suggested, Bergson intuition is memory. Okay?
Yeah.
And continuing. Bergson sees that our word memory mixes together two different kinds of memories. On the one hand, there is habit memory, which consists in obtaining certain automatic behavior by means of repetition. In other words, I know how to drive a car because of habit memory, because I've done it so many times over the years.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, it coincides with the acquisition of sensory motor mechanisms. On the other hand, there is true or pure memory. It is the survival of personal memories, a survival that for Bergson is unconscious. In other words, we have habit memory actually aligned with bodily perception. Pure memory is something else. And here we encounter Bergson's famous or infamous imagery of the memory cone, which I'm not going to get into here. So, basically what this is, he's very much working in parallel with the pragmatists of the need. Things are important to us if they fulfill a need. Truth happened to be one of the most important ones.
Right.
And the necessary poverty that it talks about is connected with the body.
Yes.
Selection occurs because of necessity or utility based in our bodies. And perception is, we saw this in the beginning, or up above, is that perception, there is a transition from the image as being in itself to its being for me. So when I perceive something, I first perceive it as in and of itself. If I see an apple on the table, I see it. I'm perceiving it in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
But then it switches to something for me. So if I'm hungry, I really pay close attention to the apple. And then I reach out and I grab the apple and I take a bite to satisfy my hunger.
Mm-hmm.
So then this object has become purposeful for me, instead of me just perceiving an apple that is on the table. I'm indifferent to it, except for perceiving it and then categorizing what it is.
Right.
Okay? But there is representation. So Bergson is a representationalist. Any kind of a representation within perception is a diminution of the image to pure perception. Okay?
Right.
And the pure perception is, in and of itself, based on the body. Is there a bodily need that is connected with it? And then with memory, there is the habit memory. I know how to drive a car. I know how to find my way home because I have a mental map. I've done this so many times, and I can easily locate where I am on a map because I know how to read a map. Also by situational awareness. I see this lamppost, I turn down the sidewalk and things like that. All this is habit memory. But personal memory, such as my 5th birthday, okay, that's a pure memory. It's not connected with anything bodily, necessarily. Although, contemporaneously speaking, there would be psychologists who are saying that, well, yeah, there are some memories that one has that are rooted in the body, particularly if you're talking about trauma. That's not what Bergson's getting at here.
Okay.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right. And I think that's enough. We'll go ahead and skip creative evolution because I don't think that's particularly important here. All right.
Okay.
So those are the broad brushstrokes of Bergson's philosophy. Questions so far?
No, I think you explained all the questions that I had about it so far.
Okay. So as we said in the beginning, Bergson is kind of ignored in the history of philosophy. He is an interesting figure because of his reactions against mechanistic philosophy at the time, which was a result of the importance that the natural sciences started to have in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Okay.
For sure.
Remember we talked before about logical positivism and all that?
Oh, for sure.
Okay, that
Yeah.
was another outgrowth of the importance of the natural sciences
Right.
coming into being. Okay. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead to the Lineage book. This is essay number 13, Henri Bergson by Paul Atkinson. This is on page 237. So Atkinson says in the second paragraph, Gilles Deleuze was largely responsible for the renewed interest in the philosophy of Bergson, which has laid to rest in many circles as far back as 1962, only 50 years after the height of his popularity. In the early part of the 20th century, Bergsonism had influenced a range of fields, including the phenomenological tradition, remember what I said about Merleau-Ponty,
Right.
artistic practice, and even social policy. The waning of interest in Bergson's work was not a gradual process, where each of his arguments was tested in a philosophical context. Rather, there was a sudden and vehement rejection of the philosophy as a whole, so great that Western philosophy in the period following the Second World War has been characterized by some thinkers as anti-Bergsonian. There are a number of reasons for this sudden change in favor, many of which can be attributed to a change in mood following the two world wars, a period in which Bergson's processual optimism seemed out of place, but also to a misreading of his philosophy as both vague and primitive. Maurice Merleau-Ponty argued that in France, many groups from all areas of academic life tried to compartmentalize Bergson's thought and effectively reduce it to a collection of incoherent and incompatible ideas. The element in his work most often misunderstood, this is on page 38, was intuition, because it is irreducible to either language or the dialectical method. Identified with the vague course of spiritualism or of some other entity, the Bergsonian intuitions lose their bite. They are generalized, minimized. The critique followed a similar path in the English-speaking world, with detractors such as George Santayana arguing that in Bergsonism there is an epistemological regression in the conflation of intuition, intellect, and instinct, and that because it recoils from any attempt to establish universal laws, it can only succeed in describing the natural world through vague, mystical conceptions such as the élan vital. In contrast, Deleuze commends Bergson for his unwillingness to posit universal laws, and carefully disassociates Bergson's philosophy from the charge of vague spiritualism through a thorough repositioning of his theory of intuition. Okay.
Okay.
So, in summary,
what is meant by the
élan.
lack of distinction between intuition, intellectualism, and instinct?
Okay, good question. So we saw this in the Stanford article. Is that, remember the discussions there about the body?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the way Bergson is defining it is intuition is somewhat comprehensive,
Right.
even with perception. So if somebody like Santayana, who wants to make a clear distinction between intuition, the intellect, the rationalization, the ratiocination, operation of the mind, and instinct, which is something unconscious. Okay. It's almost like if we'll take the triune brain. You've heard of that theory?
No.
Okay, so the triune brain is, you can split the brain into three distinct parts, one of which is the primitive brain, where instinct lies, the middle brain, which I forget exactly what the middle brain does, and then you have the higher brain, which is where cognition, abstract thinking takes place. So this is kind of simplistic, this triune brain. That's what's happening here. Intellect is one thing, instinct is another thing, intuition kind of exists in the middle. But Bergson is talking about intuition as if all three were included in that. So Santayana had a beef with that.
Okay.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So, as Atkinson points out, after the Second World War up until about 1962, and we've already seen this in 20th century philosophy, there was a turn towards logical empiricism. Actually, that was before the war, but that continued. Strict scientific empiricism, more scientific methods, analytic philosophy, Carnap and Quine, particularly in the Anglo-American sphere. And then over in France, you had Hegel, existentialism, phenomenology, and psychoanalysis.
Right.
So where does Bergson fit here? He doesn't really. And really the only phenomenologist that paid attention to him was Merleau-Ponty.
Okay.
So Bergson fell out of favor, and then they just dismissed him wholesale because they thought it was a whack job.
Okay.
Okay, so it was unfortunate.
Yeah.
But continuing on page 238. Deleuze's attraction to Bergson's work relates to the latter's marginal place within the history of philosophy, and to Deleuze's preference for those writers who escape from it in one respect, or altogether, such as Lucretius, Spinoza, Hume, Nietzsche, and Bergson. Okay, so these were the outliers, in a sense.
Okay.
All right, so next page, 239. Deleuze is not faithful to the Bergsonian body of work. If what is meant by this is a close set of writings comprising essays, books, letters, and lectures. But in another sense, he is faithful to the open and emergent features of Bergson's philosophy and their capacity to unravel in unforeseen ways. To write about Bergson, if one is also to accept his method, is akin to the act of remembering, where the past is altered as it is brought into the service of a continually changing present. Okay? Next page, page 240. Oh, wait. Yeah, 240. In taking intuition as his starting point, Deleuze avoids the overemphasized dualism between duration and space, but also one of the key problems faced by Bergson, the difficulty in describing the positive features of duration, without reference to consciousness or to the negative aspects of spatialized time. Despite its pivotal role in his philosophy, there are very few direct discussions of duration in Bergson's work, because its processual movement resists description in natural and philosophical languages, where the emphasis is on the substantive. Okay. So, a problem here is that Bergson takes intuition kind of as a given, and he doesn't do a very good job of explaining in either natural or philosophical languages what he's getting at.
Right.
He kind of assumes that it is a given, sort of. When you read about it, you kind of understand it. Okay, that's fine to a certain extent, but if you're really trying to argue a point, you're not doing a very good job if you shy away from trying to provide it in a certain framework and provide support for this theory.
Right. It's kind of like ironic because he doesn't have, in a way, he doesn't have enough of a mechanistic explanation of it.
That's true. Now, one could make the argument, and I would accept it, is that philosophy doesn't necessarily have to progress by argumentation.
Yeah.
Okay. That wasn't so important way back centuries ago. If one philosopher talked about, this is where you kind of get into the realm of, as a matter of fact, I am going through very carefully Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy? So we covered this in a previous podcast months ago, where in their definition of philosophy defines and creates concepts. Okay. It's not preoccupied with propositions. That's science's domain. So their argument, they continue, is that science doesn't create concepts. Philosophy does. Science uses concepts and propositions to achieve its own ends.
For sure.
Okay. So one could espouse a philosophy without even really rigorously arguing for it. However, this is a drawback here for his argumentation. But more importantly is difficulty describing the positive features of duration without reference to consciousness or the negative aspects of spatialized time. Okay, so duration, because Bergson talked more about perception than he did about consciousness. Okay, perception could be problematic because perception can fall into a mechanistic explanation. Okay, the brain is what is perceiving things, and the brain is perceiving things according to certain, maybe mechanistic laws. Whereas consciousness, shades of phenomenology here, whereas consciousness doesn't necessarily behave according to mechanistic laws. Okay?
Yeah.
So in other words, what Deleuze is getting at here is that Bergson is interesting, but he kind of got in his own way in talking about intuition and then talking about duration.
Right.
Okay? So,
yeah.
Continuing on the same page. Duration is aligned with the notion of consciousness unhinged from any form of external determination and comparable to the immanent plenitude of a phrase of music that is unbounded by formal notation and exists only in time. Bingo. That was a perfect example to use. To let itself live, the ego must not linger on a single perception, idea, or object, but instead attend to the flow of the whole defined only by a seamless integrity, succession without distinction, a mutual penetration, an interconnection and organization of elements, each one of which represents the whole, and cannot be distinguished or isolated from it except by abstract thought. Okay, we've already covered this in that musical example.
Right.
Okay, so continuing, this is on page 241. This positive image of duration as a given in consciousness, however, can only function as a telos meaning an end, because Bergson acknowledges that duration is mediated by our conception of time outside of consciousness. In its composite form is an admixture of extensity. Okay, so let's unpack this a minute. Duration is a given in consciousness. only function as a telos because Bergson acknowledges that duration is mediated by our conception of time outside of consciousness. So time is something that actually exists, and time is not, as Kant thought, a form of perception of the mind. Space and time being forms that the mind imposes upon experience, perception.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
So time is something that actually exists outside of consciousness. In most of Bergson's accounts of duration, there is the specter of space as an impurity that must be removed through a process of division. That is, duration can only be apprehended through stripping away, methodologically and phenomenologically, the architecture of space. The role of philosophy is to coordinate the effort by which we expel from our mind all of those features that link it to the spatial field of perception. Okay?
Right.
All right?
Okay.
Makes sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay. 242. In Bergsonism, which is a study of Bergson, Deleuze states that there are three major stages of Bergson's philosophy: duration, which we already covered, memory, which we already touched on too, and the élan vital. But rather than examining how each stage is presented as a part of Bergson's ontology, he argues instead that intuition should form the basis of their integration. So unlike Bergson, who wavers between the methodological and phenomenological, Deleuze states clearly that intuition as a method is primary because it is likely to inform us as to the nature of Bergsonian problems. Okay. So again, we define duration, we define memory. The élan vital is one way to translate it as a vital force. Okay. So élan is a French term that really doesn't have a one-to-one definition in English, except in terms of it's a force. It is it's verve, spirit, positive energy. Pick many different things. Vital meaning vital. It's a vital force, a vital energy that's moving along. When you say that somebody has élan, using the term in English, is that they have spice or zing, pep in their step, things like that. It's a positive force. It's not a negative force. Okay?
Okay.
So continuing, next page. For Bergson, intuition does not utilize ready-made concepts because it attends to the object in its specificity, giving each an explanation which would fit it exactly, and it alone. In its fit, the object cannot be separated from the precise concept, or rather the percept, that which is perceived, that is coincident with the object over time. Consequently, intuition signifies first of all consciousness, but immediate consciousness, a vision which is scarcely distinguishable from the object seen, a knowledge which is contact and even coincidence. It is the unmediated apprehension of the object that proceeds from contact with its surface to coincidence with its internal movement, and in doing so reaches across the boundaries between bodies to a state of spiritual connection. Okay?
Okay.
Makes sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So, let's see. Next page, 244. Deleuze does not dismiss Bergson's suggestion that consciousness is expanded via intuition into a processual whole, but returns the consciousness, duration and the immediate to their proper place in a series of intuitive procedures. In this respect, intuition is pragmatic in that it cleaves or articulates lines of difference rather than apprehends duration. This horizontal aspect of intuition is discussed by Bergson when he states that intuition does not require ready-made concepts, but rather mobile concepts, destined to guide other men through the same intuition or put them on the path. And as such, its role is indexical rather than referential. When grounded in a series of methodological acts, intuition, and by extension philosophy, will rival science because it will demand a new effort for each new problem. It is not a matter of effortless immediacy, since intuition must exert itself against two main sources of resistance: the overwhelming weight of philosophical and scientific history, and our perceptual and intellectual habits. Okay?
Okay.
So in other words, what science does is science operates according to standard procedures. There are procedures of experimentation, hypotheses, and universal laws that guide things. Universal is the key term here. This is the case regardless of the people involved, regardless of the social environment, regardless of the nationality, regardless of the time period, or whatever it is. These are universal, true for all time. At least they think they are true for all time. Laws that anybody can go to, take, synthesize, and operate in there. Okay, that's
Okay.
science.
Okay.
However, philosophy is not like that,
Correct. Yeah.
because it will demand a new effort for each new problem. And in order for intuition to operate pragmatically, it has to work against the weight of philosophical and scientific history. So you're looking at the history of philosophy. You're looking at a problem philosophically. What did Descartes have to say about it? What did Kant have to say about it? What did Bertrand Russell have to say about it? Whatever it is. Okay. That's the philosophical and the scientific history. And our own perceptual and intellectual habits. Now, let's talk about God exists. If I'm a radical atheist, it's just like, well, how could God exist? That doesn't compute, whatever it is. You take it as a philosophical problem, it demands a new effort for each new problem, even though maybe it's not that new of a problem. Okay.
Right.
So this is where intuition really enters the picture.
Right.
Deleuze sets out three main acts of intuition. The first concerns the stating and creating of problems. The second, the discovery of genuine differences in kind. The third, the apprehension of real time. In contrast to the vertical path of intuition, Deleuze places the apprehension of real time third in the list after the reconfiguration of philosophical problems and the cleaving of matter according to differences in kind. Even though duration underpins the articulation of problems in a Bergsonian metaphysics. Remember, duration is very key here at Bergson.
For sure.
The direct apprehension cannot come first because an explanation is required as to how we have lost the immediate connection to things in themselves. And this second characteristic of intuition is a return or restoration of the thing, where philosophy regains rather than invents. There is a process of forgetting incorporated in every act because the totality of memory cannot be sustained in consciousness. This loss is not simply an intellectual or psychological illusion, but an ontological movement whereby the apprehension of time as duration is lost in language, intellectual acts, perceptual orientation, causality, and even in the fragmentation of matter into solid bodies. For Deleuze, things begin by losing themselves in order that we finish by losing them. It must be that forgetting is found in being. Intuition must push against this tide of forgetting, be a remembering of the present, if duration is to become anything more than a conception. Okay?
Okay.
So there's an active process here. Rather than allow one to think of intuition as just a concept, a way of looking at things, or probably even a sterile method, you push against the tide of forgetting, reactivation, constantly.
Okay.
Then intuition becomes an operation.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Okay.
So then continuing. Page 245. In an extension of Bergson's argument, Deleuze and Guattari argue that philosophy is the discipline that involves creating concepts, which is a continual and imminent process cultivated in the time of the philosopher. As a movement, creating concepts can be compared to the élan vital, a vital impetus or vital spirit, that compels an organism forward only for it to be constantly confronted by obstacles in the material world that it must overcome or solve in order to continue its movement. The act of rephrasing false problems is central to intuition, and these problems can be divided into two groups. Non-existent problems, Deleuze refers to the problems that Bergson isolates, such as the relationship between order and disorder, and badly stated problems that arbitrarily group things that differ in kind, such as the conflation of sensation and intensity. One of the most interesting features of Bergson's work is the way he approaches problems. Rather than addressing the problems on their own ground, he rephrases them with respect to duration. Aporias, which is a Greek term for a seemingly insolvable problem or difficulty. Aporias that have plagued philosophy for centuries often lose their status as questions, including the famous paradoxes of Zeno, which Bergson believes involve a badly stated problem, because they confuse time and space in the imaginary form of the instant. So one of Zeno's famous paradoxes is of the arrow. We cover this at the top of the conversation with duration. So working backwards, what Bergson is getting at with the duration is you're taking the arrow from the bow. From the moment that you shoot the arrow, it travels in the air and it hits the target. You see this as a duration. You do not see this as a succession of instances, A, B, C, D, E, and so on. Because doing that helps get around the one paradox of Zeno, which is if you're how's that paradox go? I think it's time is like an arrow. That's what the paradox is.
Okay.
Because if you're looking at time as a succession of instances, time is infinite.
Right.
Rather, I don't think I'm restating it correctly, and I'm not going to look it up. But the purpose of duration is to avoid that. You're seeing it as a whole instead of a succession of instances.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
So the arbitrary grouping of badly stated problems is also central to Bergson's critique of psychophysics, a discipline that confuses the psychological state with a change in the value of an external cause. Psychophysics extracts a measurable quantity from a sensible quality, or psychic state, and wrongly argues that qualitative change is effectively determined by quantitative difference. But all this tells us is that the subject experienced a change, which we choose to call a change in intensity, and by that convention is matched by a change in an extensive magnitude. In his critique, Bergson argues that changes in intensity are actually qualitative changes, and uses the example of muscular effort, which is not simply an increase in force, but a change in the state of the body such that a greater number of muscles are implicated in an action. You, being a bodybuilder, should understand this.
Yeah. I'm not a bodybuilder, but I do work out a lot.
Right. So, not simply an increase in force, but a change in the state of the body such that the greater number of muscles are implicated in an action. So, for example, if you do barbell squats, okay, not just the legs, your back and even the whole body is involved in the squat.
For sure.
The greater number of muscles. Change of the state of the body instead of working on specifically one muscle.
Yeah.
Okay. So next page, number 246. Bergson also analyzes the metaphysical suppositions of a number of non-existent problems that have had a decisive impact on philosophical and scientific thought, of which the most famous are the analyses of order, disorder, and being, nothingness, and creative evolution. Bergson argues that these oppositions are theoretical illusions that involve a false movement from absence to presence. The opposition of being and nothingness is often phrased as a problem. Why does this principle exist rather than nothing? With many derivatives, including such questions as, why is there something rather than nothing? Nothingness is either the origin of being in ex nihilo, meaning it comes from nothing, arguments, or the eternal ground of existence. But in either case, being is that which fills the void, and the void, the eternal receptacle of being. Let me read this again. Nothingness is either the origin of being in ex nihilo arguments, or the eternal ground of existence. But in either case, being is that which fills the void, and the void the eternal receptacle of being. The effect of this way of stating the problem is that metaphysics seeks an explanation of being that will raise it to the status of the eternal, comparable to the eternity of nothingness, and in doing so overcome the idea of nothingness. Rather than directly refute the concept of nothingness, Bergson plots how the concept could have emerged. That is, he imagines it within the positivity of becoming in the form of a genetic argument. Okay?
Interesting.
So,
what are ex nihilo arguments?
well, ex nihilo means from nothing. So an
Okay.
ex nihilo argument is like, how did the world come into being? Okay. If you accept the Big Bang, it just emerged from a singular point. Or if you adopt the creationist view, is that there was a incorporeal, supersensible deity that through its actions created the world as it is.
Right.
Okay. The Big Bang is kind of within the same territory as an ex nihilo argument, because you're like, well, what existed before the Big Bang? Nothing.
Right.
And so the Big Bang just emerged.
Right.
Okay.
Unless you believe theories that there was even existence before the Big Bang.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting point, and that's what the next line is. In either case, being is that which fills the void, and the void the eternal receptacle of being. Okay. Now we think of Heidegger here. So again, the common misunderstanding about being with the big B is that it is a distinct being, as would the being of an apple would be, the being of a computer would be, the being of a human being would be. Dasein. That's not the case. Being is just there. It's also not a concept, which also adds to the confusion.
Right.
Why, and then the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Okay, so Bergson is attempting to avoid this question. Plots how the concept could have emerged, and that he imagines it within the positivity of becoming in the form of a genetic argument. So becoming, coming into being, instead of just appears, or there is nothing. You know, becoming is also very important to Deleuze too, as we've noticed in the other essays.
For sure.
All right. So let's see, continuing. So on the same page, Atkinson continues, he says, nothingness might serve as the condition for imagining the eternal in philosophy. But for Bergson, it is actually produced from within the plenitude of perception and memory, as the virtual absence is carved out of the perceptual continuity of radical becoming by a recollection projected onto the present. This is expressed in the form of the question, why is this object here rather than the other recollected object? And underlying this question is an imagined substitution where the absent object takes its place. If an imagined object can be substituted, it can also be excluded. That is, imagined is absent from the plenitude, and this becomes the foundation for a general concept of nothingness, as the extrapolation of this possible exclusion to all things. As the extrapolation of this possible exclusion to all things. So, in a sense, nothingness, the concept of nothingness is derivative, not primacy.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
In this critique, contrary to most metaphysical accounts, Bergson argues that there is actually more in the concept of nothingness than in being, because it combines recollection and perception. This is also true of negation, which is comprised of an affirmation of being in the form of an existential statement, to which is added the judgment that it does not exist.
Right.
Okay.
That sort of reminds me of like Heidegger's definition of the nothing, like that we like in order to think about nothing, we have to think about something.
Right.
Like there's not even really an accurate way to conceptualize the idea of nothing.
Right. And if you try to conceptualize nothing, you make it into something.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me read this other statement, this other sentence again, particularly important. Also true of negation, which is comprised of an affirmation of being in the form of an existential statement, to which is added the judgment that it does not exist. So
Right.
negation, in a sense, is derivative from a positive statement.
Right.
Is not only comes from an is,
Right.
not the other way around.
Yeah.
But continuing, however, the negation is qualitatively different to the affirmation because it is not an existential statement about a particular object or a particular moment in becoming, but a judgment of a judgment. Judgment of a judgment. This asymmetry serves as the ground for Bergson's distinction between the actual and the possible, where the actual is what passes and is affirmed, noted or noticed, in experience rather than conceptualized, whereas the possible is always a secondary judgment on objects that have already been abstracted. Okay?
Right.
So the actual is before the possible. The possible is a secondary judgment.
Right. Right.
Okay? So I will think I skipped the next paragraph. Let's go to page 248. Let's see. Okay, Atkinson continues. The recovery of genuine differences in kind involves a reorientation of philosophy from difference as alterity, or as the French altérité, usually in the form of contradiction and opposition, to difference as alteration, that which both differs from itself and differs in kind. Difference, as alteration, does not adhere to the external surface of things, which yields an infinite number of points of view, but instead expresses an internal difference, where difference is stabilized in the unity of a process, such as the integration of memory with the present. The difficulty for philosophy is how to enact a shift from the external and endlessly juxtaposed differences to genuine differences, without positing an unreachable thing in itself. For Deleuze, and to a lesser degree Bergson, this requires a methodological procedure, and consequently Deleuze interpolates into the act of discovering genuine differences two characteristics of intuition that are intermittently employed by Bergson: articulations of the real and lines of fact. And so quickly, the articulations of the real are differences that relate to the natural function and development of an object, and are most easily understood in the example of living bodies which have developed their form according to an internal movement or a broader evolutionary movement. Okay. Next page, 249. The lines of fact form the basis of Bergson's empiricism and describe the gradual ascent from the articulations of the object to states of higher probability. Experience is the starting point for the lines of fact, but the intellect expands the experience along a line of probability well beyond the immediately given. Okay, so those are the lines of fact. Now you notice is that Deleuze accepts intuition,
Mm-hmm.
changes it up a bit from what Bergson had in mind. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's see. Continuing. Trying to skip through Bergson here and get to more Deleuze. Okay, next page 250. Okay, so one other thing about Bergson is in one of his later books called Creative Evolution. So Bergson accepted evolution, survival of the fittest, natural selection, and so on and so forth. But again, he did not take it as a purely mechanistic approach. Also, he asserted that there was a creative element involved in evolution. This was not something that was following, again, a blind mechanistic process, but rather evolution as the force is creating something else in its evolution. So there
Right.
is a creative force at work here.
Yeah. I like that way of looking at it.
Yeah. So this evolutionary argument is in turn integrated in a higher level of movement where the tendency of life pushes against the inelasticity of matter. Okay. Deleuze highlights this argument because it decenters Bergson's ontology, despite the fact that it begins with consciousness. Intuition isolates the lines of fact which are like mathematical differentials, lines of movement tangential to consciousness, that must be integrated or resolved in a new conception of consciousness as part of a broader tendency. For Deleuze, integration is one reason why Bergson maintains an interest in the infinitesimal calculus, despite his critique of the spatializing language of mathematics. Okay. Why the interest in the infinitesimal calculus is because it is, as we saw with the Leibniz essay, approaching infinity, but it will never reach the end. Okay. So consciousness is not, at least I'm reading this, it's not bounded finitely. It could possibly be possibly infinite.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay. So integration takes a portion of a line describing motion and extends this to envisage the whole line, in the same way that philosophy should take a portion of experience and broaden it.
Wait, is the concept of consciousness being infinite, is that panpsychism?
No, I would not say it's panpsychism. Rather, how best to explain this? In what it can consider. Okay, so consciousness, maybe in a sense, is finite. It's not infinite in the sense of consciousness, quasi-idealistically, panpsychism, however you want to. No, that's not what we're getting at here. Rather, consciousness and what it considers and what it can move, and it can move beyond, is potentially infinite.
Okay.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Makes sense? All right, continuing. In following the lines of fact along the curve of experience, there is both an intention to the presentness of experience and a movement toward what Deleuze calls, or what Deleuze states, are the conditions of experience, the true object of philosophy. The brain is not an object that can be analyzed in itself, a container for consciousness, or an object that is revealed by morphology alone. But the meeting point of two tendencies, the space opened up in matter by the movement of life. Okay, let me read that again. The meeting point of two tendencies, the space opened up in matter by the movement of life.
What does that mean?
That's kind of a profound statement right there. So let's unpack this a minute. So the brain is a physical organ. Okay. Where is consciousness? That's a question that philosophers are still asking about today.
For sure.
What is consciousness? Where is consciousness?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Does consciousness exist solely in the brain? Some might say it does.
Mm-hmm.
Others might say that consciousness is the brain and the nervous system, maybe even the entire body. Okay. Consciousness is within the organism. But how do we know that other organisms have consciousness?
We don't.
Okay. That's an interesting question. Now, if you're taking the simplistic tack that consciousness resides in the brain, that's not what we're getting at here.
Mm-hmm.
The brain is not an object that can be analyzed in itself, a container for consciousness, or an object that is revealed by morphology alone. Okay.
Yeah.
Morphology meaning the form of the brain, it is a physical organ, what is its operations, and so on and so forth. Okay. The meeting point of two tendencies, the space opened up in matter by the movement of life. Okay. So the brain is a living organ. It changes over time. It is affected by things like old age, decrepitude, bad diet, injury, pollution, all these kind of things. Okay. So it's not a static organ. And the movement of life, life continues moving forward. It is pushing up against the inelasticity of matter. When you're working your muscles, you're working against atrophy.
Mm-hmm.
That is the life force. Now, where does that life force come from? That's another good question. No. The space opened up in matter by the movement of life. So the brain is a physical organ made up of matter, but with the movement of life, on a side note, I heard, Roger Penrose is a famous British mathematician, and I heard him on Joe Rogan about a month or so ago, where he was talking. He's also done books on consciousness, where he references some physicists who are investigating. I forget exactly what they are, but the type of tubes that make up neurons, because the neurons are one of the fundamental building blocks of the brain. And maybe consciousness is a byproduct of the operation of these tubes within the neurons, or the activity in the neurons. So basically, is consciousness kind of, yes, is an emergent phenomenon of the operations of the brain.
Yeah.
But the brain is not a vessel in which consciousness is to be seen, because I open up your skull and I open up your brain. Where's consciousness? I don't see it.
Right.
Okay. That's what we're working against. We don't want this container metaphor.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
it's almost like we sort of invented the concept of consciousness in the same way that we sort of invented the concept of time, or at least the way we tend to define them.
Right, but how you define time. Now, again, Bergson accepts that time is something that exists separate from us. Okay. Not that it is just a category of the mind, or it's something that the clock produces. Interestingly enough, there is a book I saw as I was combing through the internet the other day, where it's a comparison book with Bergson and Einstein. So
Oh,
I don't know to
interesting.
what extent Bergson influenced Einstein, but their concepts of time are not that dissimilar. The reality of time.
Right.
Okay. So let's continue. This explanation, space opened up in matter by the movement of life. This explanation is not located in the present, but in an indefinite future, a virtual point where the lines of facts conjoin to serve as the sufficient reason of the thing. The lines of facts and the tendencies they reveal are not restricted to any one field, but cross and intersect in the general movement of life. And it is for this reason that Bergson can employ arguments on the nature of instinct and the vital impetus to explain the mystical tradition in religion.
Interesting.
Yes. In fact, one of his later books is The Two Sources of Morality and Religion.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, I'm just seeing how much there is here.
Okay.
All right. Okay, next page, 251. In isolating the movement of experience, Bergson is not describing a clear, abstract, or smooth concept, as suggested by the image of mathematical integration. Rather, it is, as Deleuze reiterates, the movement of a percept, percept being that which is perceived. The simplicity of the tendency does not inhere in the clear form of the curve of experience, but in its explanatory power to correlate and integrate the widest range of differences in kind. Bergson uses the example of an artillery shell, which is shot into the air and bursts into fragments, each of which continues to divide until it hits the ground. The shape and path of the fragments is a product of the interaction of the explosive force of the powder with the resistance of the metallic shell casing. The aim is to understand the movement of the trajectory rather than simply to plot the individual objects. This goes back to duration. By analogy, evolutionary theory must recognize that the tendency of life is manifest as a force, which proceeds through the division of matter. The difficulty lies in the fact that we perceive only what is nearest to us, namely the scattered movements of the pulverized explosions. From them, we have to go back, stage by stage, to the original movement. The movement of the trajectory is something that is readily understandable as a continuity of change, but this process of alteration is not readily yielded in the examination of the individual parts. Okay? So, evolution is a force. It is not some randomized operation taking place. That's one thing. And in the example of the artillery shell, we perceive only what is nearest to us, but then we have to go back to the original movement. So if we're talking about a trajectory of experience, even in evolution, how is evolution explained? Darwin came up with the theory which was then expanded from that by working backwards, according to a theory, by lots of observation, what Darwin did, and then he came up with this theory. Okay, so we haven't seen evolution, really. Evolution is not quick. It takes place very slowly over a long period of time. All we see is the product of it. But the theory compels us, we come up with the theory to explain by reaching back to what we think happened based on what's in front of us. I like this artillery shell example, is you're only looking at the fragments of the metallic shell casing. But the shape and path came from the interaction of the explosive force and the shell casing itself. So evolution took place with the interaction of many different things. That's where the difficulty lies and why it is a theory.
For sure.
Okay. Let's see. So we're just going to skip these. All right. Next page, 252. In this regard, there is clearly a dominant tendency insofar as the ascent, the movement of the élan vital, describes difference in its simplest, most highly integrated form, as differentiation or the movement that differs from itself. This incorporates all the other forms of movement and change in Bergson's work, including the accumulation of the past, the movement of life, and so on. Because it unifies duration as both an account of time and substance. Duration, tendency, is the difference of self from self. And what differs from itself is immediately the unity of substance and subject. For Deleuze, the ceaseless and immediate differentiation underpinning all other actual, real, or possible differences is the virtual. We'd seen this before. The simplicity of the virtual is that it provides a necessary and sufficient explanation of substance as the generation of differences in kind without recourse to external explanations such as first or final causes. In the virtual, there is a singular and immediate movement of actualization, unlike the immediacy of the whole, which lacks lines of actualization. In the creative act of differentiation, where the present does not resemble the past. Okay, so in other words, the actual results from the virtual. Okay. And that is self-contained. You don't have to make a reference to a first or a final cause.
Right.
In the generation of differences. Now remember, difference among all the concepts that are related with Deleuze. Difference is number one. Put it at the top of the list.
Yeah.
Okay. So differences are generated from within, not from without. Using the virtual.
Right.
Okay. I'm skipping around here a little bit because this essay actually is more about Bergson than it is about Deleuze.
Okay.
All right. So in the next page, 253, Atkinson continues, Deleuze states that Bergson's thought evolved such that duration seemed to him to be less and less reducible to a psychological experience and became instead the variable essence of things, providing the theme of a complex ontology. Okay, so in Deleuze's reading, he's taking duration not as a psychological experience, but as a underpinning of ontology.
Okay.
The method of intuition redraws the lines of Bergson's work, such that the complex ontology underpins the apprehension of real time as a series of ideas integrated or folded into the whole. It is only in recognizing the openness of the whole, found here in the virtual, that the radical nature of duration can be fully realized. Okay.
Okay.
So then duration becomes an ontological concept, not a psychological concept.
Okay.
Okay. Right. Continuing. The metaphorical basis of so much of Bergson's work contrasts markedly with Deleuze's integration of Bergsonian ideas in the methodology of intuition, because Deleuze looks to distill concepts from Bergson's heuristic examples. For example, in the elevation of nuance as the sufficient explanation of the essence of the thing. In contrast to its invocation in the encyclopedia entry, there is an examination in the difference essay. This is one of Deleuze's essays on Bergson, of the other meaning the term nuance to refer to a shade or color and how the shade should be placed within the broader spectrum of white light. There is a distinct difference in the way Bergson and Deleuze treat the same examples. Bergson's metaphors do not readily yield concepts or lines of integration, and many of his arguments are actually formed in the space between metaphors. Indeed, Bertrand Russell criticized Bergson for his use of similes and analogies, and remarked that an argument taking such techniques cannot be refuted any more than a work of Shakespeare can be considered indirect. Okay, so
Okay.
we touched on this at the top of the conversation, where one reason why Bergson fell out of favor is because the rigorous English philosophers, Bertrand Russell happened to be one of those, really tore him to pieces because of his lack of rigorous argumentation.
Right.
And then he just kind of fell out of favor.
Yeah.
So Bergson is using metaphors more often than he is in argumentation. Again,
Yeah.
it's not necessarily a bad thing, but
Yeah. I mean, like some of my favorite philosophers do that, like Foucault, for example.
right, or even Nietzsche.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we're let's see. Okay, so I'll go ahead and close out with this paragraph. We're at the end of the essay. The integration of Bergson's theory of intuition into the genetic movement of the virtual leaves open the question as to the form that future Bergson scholarship might take. It is noteworthy that Bergson himself does not perform a similar reappraisal of his own method, although there are many beginnings, including the 2 introductions to Creative Mind and the articles on the perception of change, the possible and the real, and Introduction to Metaphysics. But for the most part, his approach is heuristic and synthetic. Bergson constantly wandered into new fields of inquiry using intuitive acts of the kind later outlined by Deleuze. Bergson's resistance to a Deleuzian-style methodological integration probably issues from his suspicion of ready-made concepts which have the capacity to alienate an idea from its empirical context. It is noteworthy that Bergson wrote only one book addressing the work of a single philosopher, his Latin doctoral thesis on Aristotle. Impressive. Preferring to develop new concepts rather than provide detailed critiques of existing methods. Aha. Like Deleuze, Bergson maintained his interest in scientific change, and most of his works begin with a discipline-specific scientific problem. Psychology in both time and free will and matter and memory, biology and creative evolution, and physics and duration and simultaneity. This describes a possible path for the continuation of Bergson's philosophy, as the recent changes in the fields of physics and biology provide fertile ground for the investigation of the fine grain of the virtual, the larval subjects and infra-empirical intensive concepts that had yet to emerge in Bergson's biologism. Uh,
What is meant by larval there?
well, a larvae, whereas the emergence of a butterfly,
I know what a larva is, but it sounds like he's using it metaphorically.
he is using it metaphorically.
Okay.
Yeah, larva to pupa, and then to butterfly.
Oh, okay, so it's like the first stage.
The first stage.
Okay.
Also, there is as progressing through the stages, there's a continuity to it, and it's the same organism.
Okay.
Not unlike how a child grows into an adult.
Right.
Okay, except with the larval, it is it starts from an egg. It's a larva, pupa, and so on.
Right.
Okay, another path would be to return to Bergson's philosophy and find further differences in kind, as Deleuze does in the Cinema books with his indifferentiation of the theses on movement before their inevitable integration to a cinematic ontology. In this differentiation, it is not so much a question of remaining faithful to the philosopher, to what was said, but of discussing what might have been had he followed the same lines in his own work. Bergson's heritage, like his philosophy, is dynamic, and a return to the past would always result in the extension of a new lines of differentiation beyond the trend of experience. The end. Okay. So what we take from this essay is that Deleuze was very much influenced by Bergson to a certain extent, but not entirely, because Bergson, because he didn't rely so much on strict argumentation or in strict concepts, rather that he kind of went with the flow and he used metaphors and similes, and then he was more concerned about creating concepts than working with existing concepts,
Right.
made him fall out of favor after World War II. And then he was just ridiculed and pushed off to the side. But Deleuze goes back in because, fast forwarding to what is philosophy, this is what Deleuze and Guattari are doing, as they define philosophy as creating concepts.
Right.
Okay. So that, yes, so these particular concepts, particularly of duration, avoiding a mechanistic approach, intuition as a method or as an operation of consciousness, really in this case, and then as the l'élan vital, as the acknowledgement that there is some kind of a life force that is working, particularly within evolution, but within life itself, instead of a sterile, mechanistic, robotic universe.
Right. For
Okay?
sure.
So that's Bergson's influence on Deleuze.
Okay. All right.
Okay?
Well, yeah,
Any,
that was very interesting and educational as always. And yeah, those are some really interesting perspectives that I. It's interesting that Deleuze, and it makes sense that he capitalized on those particular aspects of Bergson. It makes sense with the way he approaches philosophy, and it's that part too about applying difference in particular, which as you said, is
oh, yeah.
very important to Deleuze, is good too. So
Right. So
yeah,
we're seeing it crop up in almost every essay in this book about difference and the production of difference.
for sure.
So using somebody like Bergson, not to mention all the other philosophers that he focus on, is the creation of difference. Again, we're looking at the virtual versus the actual. The virtual is also enormously important for Deleuze.
For sure.
Difference emerging from the self-contained and the vital and the actual rather than coming from without,
Yeah,
among
for
many
sure.
other things we've already covered. And that's it. Any final questions or comments?
No, I think you did a good job of summing it up there as well. That's basically the way I was gonna sum it up, and along with the concepts of consciousness and time, those ways of looking those, and with respect to intuition in particular, is very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah,
A certain description of intuition. This is
yeah,
not because intuition, again, because Bergson is not rigorous in his argumentation, it's a bit of a slippery concept,
yeah,
but it is important nonetheless.
yeah, for sure,
Okay.
for sure. All right.
Okay.
Well, yeah, thanks as always for that awesome conversation and education about Bergson. And yeah, like I always say, thanks so much to everyone who watches this, and especially to those of you who like and share this video, and to those of you who subscribe to my channel, and particularly thanks to those of you who contribute to me on Patreon. I really appreciate that. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. And also, think about intuition, time, consciousness, difference, and so many other subjects that Bergson and Deleuze discussed and wrote about. And any last words there, Chief? I called
Sure.
you Chief.
Sure. So next time we're going to be covering Edmund Husserl.
Okay.
And then I'm kind of excited about this because now we're starting to get into phenomenology.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'm very ignorant about phenomenology, I would say. All I've really learned is, I guess, maybe what we've covered in Heidegger about that.
Yeah,
Which,
he belongs to the phenomenological tradition. Now, I can
yeah.
say this, I'll reiterate it when we go to the essay next time, is that phenomenology really is not a philosophy.
Okay.
It's a method because you see the term phenomenology in a non-philosophical context. A sociologist could use the term, well, when looking at this phenomenologically, even a physicist could say, well, looking at this phenomenologically. It's a method. What is phenomenology? It's the study of the phenomena, that which appears.
Right.
It was important in Heidegger because Heidegger was a student of Edmund Husserl. He began his career in the phenomenological tradition, and then he did away with that. He went in a different direction. And as we'll see in the next essay on Husserl, is that particularly for French academics at the time, some of them were radically anti-phenomenological. Other ones are just kind of like, well, it's Deleuze had a love-hate relationship with it because there are some important things of phenomenology, but there are also some harebrained things of phenomenology.
Okay.
And phenomenology was also important for Sartre and the existentialist tradition there.
Okay.
Okay. So phenomenology has a rich history and a rich pedigree, and it is still important today. Hell, there are philosophers that are still considered themselves phenomenologists. Dan Zahavi is one that comes to mind. He's active in the UK, and he's written some books on the subject, but we'll save that for next time.
Would you say that Zizek is?
Zizek, no, I would not call
No?
him a phenomenologist.
Okay.
Zizek is primarily a Lacanian.
Okay.
Remember
I
that.
was just wondering because I know he calls himself a Hegelian. I don't remember. Would Hegelian be a phenomenologist or not?
Well, that was it was not the first appearance of phenomenology, maybe the first important appearance of phenomenology, because what is the phenomenology of mind or the phenomenology of spirit? The one work. It is the examination of the phenomena of what spirit is.
Yeah.
Okay. But Husserl had a different take on it, as did Merleau-Ponty, as did Sartre, and all those. You know,
Okay.
Hegel talked about consciousness, but not consciousness as a product of the mind that exists within the head. This is more like consciousness. This is a wider consciousness, more along the lines of what you were talking about with panpsychism. Okay.
Okay.
The consciousness of the absolute, of spirit, whatever it is. I'm not doing it justice when I explain about it, but it's a much, much broader definition.
Okay.
Okay. But we'll get
All
to
right.
that next time.
All right. Sounds good. All right. Well, thanks again, everyone, and adios until next time.
Bye.